Well, hello and an extremely warm welcome to my channel. My name's Louise. I love to waffle on about books, and it just transpires that I've been reading now for the best part of 60 years because I've just had my 60th birthday. And I thought this would be a brilliant moment to reflect on what that reading experience has been like over the last 60 years, and also just to think about the books that have had an impact or sort of connected with my personal life in some way, as all books do. So I was reading before I started school. So I started school at 4. So, obviously, even from a very young age, I was really, really into my books. I was encouraged by my mum, who was an avid reader, who'd been encouraged by her parents, who couldn't afford to have books in the house, but used to regularly take her to the library. So libraries have played a really important part in my reading life. But I remember being gifted this particular book, and this is the stories of Hans Andersen. And this book is so, so special to me because I used to love curling up with my mum, and she would read this to me. And in particular, my favourite story, which actually is illustrated here, especially on the back, I think it might give you a sense of what it is. It's the story of the Snow Queen, which I still absolutely adore. And I do remember my mum as well taking me to see a production of the Snow Queen. And I think I felt really grown up when I had this book, because although there's the story of the tinderbox, you can see the lovely illustrations, there aren't many pictures in here. So whereas my younger siblings were still into their picture books, I felt grown up enough, because I was a couple of years older, to be reading or having read to me a book that didn't have many pictures in. And it actually says in the front, on the first page of this book, to Louise, with lots of love and a happy birthday from Mummy and Daddy. So this was gifted to me in 1972 on my 7th birthday. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up books, 3 books per decade. I was just going to do 1 per decade, and it was absolutely impossible. So, fasten in your seatbelts, we could be here for quite a while. But I'm really looking forward to sort of getting to grips with why I chose these books. And it's a weird thing, isn't it? Another week, another day, I might have chosen different things. So the next book from my first decade is Little House in the Big Woods by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Now, I remember definitely that this was the very first book that I was grown up enough to read completely unaided, as in the first book in this adult format. I'm wondering whether it's got, no, it hasn't. It's got my name in very, very neat handwriting. Look how proud I was. But I think I was probably, I don't know, around 9-10 years old. And I've got such happy memories of reading this. I think my mum possibly read some of these stories when she was younger. There are at least 7 of these books. And I just loved travelling across the American landscape. I was only little, I didn't really know anything about other parts of the world at all. It was the early 1970s. I think the first time I went abroad I was 8, and I went to Holland. So reading about a different part of the world. I remember being fascinated by Laura's relationship with her dad, going out and watching him chop wood, and the fact that they lived they were living a pioneering life in America, and the fact that they lived a life so different, so alien to mine. Descriptions of tapping trees and butchering pigs and all the things that people had to do to survive. It really, really made an impression on me as a child, and I gobbled up all the others. And another novel that really, really shaped me was The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. I've read this novel many times and also have a real fond affection for the film version as well. But I think the thing I love about this, it focuses on a character. I think she's called Mary Lennox, isn't she? And she discovers this garden that's been completely neglected. And alongside her, I want to say he's her cousin, who's actually in a wheelchair. He's non-ambulant, and he's got quite a spiky character. Through the medium of the garden, they sort of get to know each other better. And I think for me, what stayed in my head about this book is the descriptions of digging in the dirt and watching things grow. Things coming up in the spring. Now, I'm a really, really keen, passionate gardener. I spend an awful lot of my time outside digging, planting, clipping, whatever. And I'm absolutely sure that part of the influence on me as a gardener was reading this beautiful book when I was a child. And then I think I was probably, I don't know, I would say about 11 or 12, so creeping into my second decade, when I picked this book up. Now, you can't even see what it is, can you? Because I've read it so many times. And this is a very battered, much loved, second-hand when I had it. The previous owner had it in 1934. It's got really, really rough paper. It's not very sort of nice on the hands, but the familiarity of it is wonderful. It's Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. And this book, I think, maybe sparked my inner feminist, because I just so identified with the character of Jo March, who was an aspiring writer. She valued her education. She was what we would now call possibly, or we wouldn't now call actually, but in my childhood we would have called a tomboy. She was as comfortable climbing a tree as she was uncomfortable doing her needlework. I really enjoyed her really vivacious relationship with her next door neighbour Laurie, who was much wealthier. I liked the take on the sort of, I don't think I was aware of it at the time, but I think, I grew up being encouraged to have a social conscience, and I think there's an element of that in this novel which probably chimed with me. And also a household full of sisters. I have 2 younger sisters and a younger brother. So, there was a certain resonance there, I think, in the story. And the other thing that I found really powerful about this was that it tugged at my emotions. It tugged at my heartstrings. I really remember feeling deeply as I read this book, because the father is absent at war during most of the novel, and thinking about, I was fortunate enough to have my dad at home throughout my childhood, in fact throughout my life, and the idea of the absent father really tugged at me. And then I really got into Thomas Hardy. So again, I know how old I was, because when I opened this, I was amazed. This is Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy. I'd completely forgotten this. So this is the Ernest Bailey Grammar School Matlock Junior History Prize, presented to Louise Savage of 3B in 1980. So I would have been 15, would I? Yes, in 1980. And this was not the first Thomas Hardy that I read. I'd read quite a few by this stage. I'd read The Mayor of Casterbridge, and I'd read Tess the D'Urbervilles, and I'd read Far from the Madding Crowd. But this is one that I really wanted. So I remember being asked what we would like as our gift. We were gifted a book, and this was the one I chose. And interestingly, I think this book influenced my choice of degree, because it's one of the most tragic, heartrending stories. There's a scene in this novel, if you've never read it, I'm not going to say, that I think is the most upsetting scene that I've read in any literature anywhere. And it tells the story of Jude, who is a stonemason, but he wants to educate himself. So he starts to learn Latin, and he starts to learn Greek. And I think this really piqued my interest in ancient languages. I was lucky enough to be learning Latin at school, but I think through the process of reading this book, it really engaged me with the idea of studying ancient languages in a very different way, and maybe put them on a pedestal a little bit, something for me to aspire to manifest at that young age. So yeah, it was interesting pulling that off the shelf. I'm just going to put these down here. And then we have this absolute tome, which is Gone with the Wind. Now, for some reason, me and my friends were really obsessed with this film, the film version first. And I remember the night before my O-levels, when I was 16, the night before we went to collect our O-level results, me and my friend and my sister went to watch the film of Gone with the Wind. It just so happened to be on at the local cinema. And because it's such a long film, we thought it would distract us from our impending exam results. I did really well, by the way, so I didn't really have anything too much to be worried about. But I also read Gone with the Wind at least twice when I was in my mid to late teens. I think the sort of the romance of Scarlett O'Hara and Rhett Butler really appealed to me. I think by then I'd also got quite a fascination with American fiction. You know, maybe that was triggered by reading Little House in the Big Woods. But yeah, this covers the whole scope of the American Civil War. And yeah, the sort of the impact of the war on this very spoilt Southern belle. I loved all the dresses, I loved all the drama, but I also absolutely soaked up the history as well, and the trials and tribulations, the ups and downs of the characters. And I think probably this was one of the first books that introduced me to thinking about the plight of Black people in America, or anywhere really. You know, the issues of racism. So yeah, it was part of. I know, and it sounds ridiculous now because I would have been, you know, 14, 15 when I first read it. How naive. But it was a very, very different world that I was growing up in, a tiny little village where, you know, there was one Black face in the area where I grew up. So so yeah, I this book really, really still sits with me. And wow, what an education this was on the similar topic. I remember a friend of mine gifting me this. Unfortunately, I haven't got the date. Oh no, I have. It says 1989. But a friend of mine gifted this book to me. And I had never read anything like it. I think I was, I want to say my first year of university, but it might have been before then. No, 1980. Yeah, see, I think that date's wrong. I think I read it earlier than that, but maybe I've misremembered. But I hadn't read a book, I don't think, by a Black novelist, certainly not a Black female novelist, at that point in my life. And this just absolutely blew me away. And I've been a massive fan of Maya Angelou ever since. I think she writes with such candid positivity about a really deeply traumatic childhood. And she really, really, for the first time, made me, I think, totally sort of get why racism is such a very, very evil, pernicious thing. And yet she does it with such joy. And again, I went on to read all these books, the books that followed, and lots of her poetry too. So yeah, really, really wise, courageous, interesting woman who had so many strings to her bow, a singer, an actor, etc., etc. So I think about her with a lot of warmth. I think she was responsible for a real. I was already political, but I think my politics moved in different directions once I'd read this book. Having said I was very political, one of my favourite comedians in the 1980s was a guy called Ben Elton. And he seems very establishment now, but he was responsible, for those of you who've seen it, for the television series. He co-wrote it with, I forgot the name of the guy, Blackadder, which was a massive success in the UK. And but he also had a late night comedy show which was quite sensationalist at the time, and I just found him absolutely hilarious. He's very left wing, so his politics chimed with mine. And he brought out this novel called Stark. And I remember my first husband, we weren't married at the time, but we met when we were students at university. And this book is really special to me because Ben Elton was on tour, and we didn't manage to go to the tour, but my first husband did go out to the bookshop in Newcastle where we were living and got it signed for me. So, you know, I've got a real sort of special feeling for this book. For Louise, with love, Ben Elton, it says in the front there. And I think probably this is, well, I know it is the first book that I ever had signed on my behalf or at all. And I remember reading it and finding it absolutely hilarious. It's a what's the word? It's a protest book, really. It's a sort of campaigning against it. Stark is this this character or project of this millionaire who kind of owns everything. I mean, you know, this book, I reckon, I mean, I haven't read it since, but would still stand the test of time, because it's about multimillionaires setting up projects. You know, this is a project in deepest, you know, darkest Australia, middle of nowhere, and the idea is that he's going to make millions out of environmental disaster. So in many ways, this book was ahead of its time. At some point, I really ought to reread it or listen to it on audio. And then I move on to reading Birdsong by Sebastian Faulks. This book I have never really quite recovered from, because it tells the story of a young sapper in the war, and it describes the trenches and the Somme, so it's the First World War, and the engineering and the conditions that the soldiers were in a way that I have never encountered since. There's something, for me personally, incredibly visceral about this novel. Again, I never went to the trenches. Hopefully I will never experience anything like that. But this was the first novel that I think I read where I felt that I'd almost had the lived experience of the men who were doing that, if you get what I mean. It really made me think about the power of the novel to help you to experience things that are absolutely beyond your understanding. And again, that might seem like a very sort of naive thing to say, but I think this book, it just totally shook me, and I'm still crawling through those trenches now. It shocked me, it appalled me. There is the most fantastically sensuous love story in here as well at the beginning of the novel. Again, you know, many of these books I really ought to reread. I know I'm talking about them in quite vague terms because, you know, some of them I read many, many years ago, but I went on to read lots of Sebastian Faulks' novels and have really enjoyed them. But this one, oh my goodness, it's a fantastic, fantastic book. Not for the faint-hearted. And then I had to pick this. This is a bit of a cheat in a way, because I just had realised that I'd got to my third decade, I think, third decade, and hadn't mentioned any Margaret Atwood. So this isn't necessarily my favourite Margaret Atwood novel. What a tome it is. This is a really hefty hardback version I've got here. And I bought it in hardback, which, you know, I wouldn't have splashed out on hardbacks very much at all at that time in my life because I couldn't really afford it. But I bought it because I would be desperate to read it because I was such an avid Margaret Atwood fan. So I couldn't talk about Cat's Eye or The Robber Bride because they were all in the wrong decade. So I picked The Blind Assassin. But this book I thought was wonderful because it's to do with the relationship between two sisters. One of the sisters drives her car off a bridge, I think it is, and the repercussions of her death and the way it makes her elder sister review their relationship, and the kind of the destruction in its wake, because the sister who's died has had a novel published called The Blind Assassin. And it's a really quite an explicit novel for its time. I think it's the 1930s when this novel is set. And the novel has this kind of cult following. So I really enjoyed the idea of a novel having power and people gathering momentum around it, and sort of really, yeah, having this kind of cult influence like many novels do. And that whole power of novels to divide people, to form allegiances. It's why I love being involved with one of the reasons why I love being involved with the Women's Prize so much, because there's all that speculation about what works for one person doesn't work for another, and all those conversations about books. So I love the way that she set this imaginary novel at the centre of her own novel. I thought it was great. Oh Lord, sorry, my book pile's just collapsed. And then we come to this book, Small Island by Andrea Levy. And again, I will never forget reading this novel. It explores race in a way that I probably hadn't read since I read Maya Angelou. I'm not sure what year I read this book. 2007. So I'm trying to work out what 20 years ago, so I would have been in my early 40s. Yes. And I had not, you know, again, I love the way books expose your own ignorance, because I had not, and again, it says so much about how biased, is that the right word? How whitewashed our education system has been, because I knew nothing about the involvement of Black Afro-Caribbean men in the war, and you know, and the fact that they'd been trained in the UK, that they'd lived in the UK. It really captures beautifully, you know, the attitudes of people when I was a small child towards race. In some ways it made me feel quite positive, that I felt we'd moved on a little bit. I think we've still got a way to go from, you know, the position that we were in when I was younger. But yeah, just a charming story, and the voices in this novel are so true and real, and it's just beautifully imagined. Everything from the title to its execution, it's just a beautiful book. And I remember really well picking up The Birth of Venus in a local charity shop here. I don't think I'd been living here very long. I think we moved here in 2005. No, 2006. And the reason I love this book is because it has one of the most shocking openings I've ever read in a novel. I can't reveal to you what it is in case you want to go away and read it. But it introduced me also to Sarah Dunnant, who writes the most fantastic historical fiction. Particularly this one, I think, focuses on ancient Florence. Renaissance Florence. And I've read almost all, not quite all, of her novels, and every single one, they usually focus on art, and they often have really strong central female characters, but she writes about things like the Medicis and so on. So her books have given me so much pleasure. And isn't it lovely the way that you can pick up a book in a charity shop for a very, you know, small sum of money, and it can take you off in all these incredible directions. We're at the end of my nearly at the end of my 5th decade now, and I couldn't have done this vlog without mentioning Yoan Ivey, because I absolutely adore her writing. And she wrote this book called The Snow Child, which just totally transported me, and actually in a way took me first full circle right back to reading Hans Andersen's fairy tales, because this book has the quality of a fable, and it centres on an older couple who haven't been able to have children, and then this red hooded child appears in the snow outside their house, and does she exist or doesn't she? It's just beautiful writing, really evocative. The landscape has stayed with me, and those the characters of the elderly couple as well. It's a wonderful, poignant, beautiful, still, thoughtful novel. And then we come to Hamnet. In fact, I realised that I've done this in a slightly achronological order, but we're on my sixth decade now, and this has to be one of the most powerful novels I've ever read. It captures grief in a way that nothing else I've ever read has, and I suspect will. It tells the story of Shakespeare's wife, Anne Hathaway, and of the demise of their son through plague. And yeah, it's the character that she's called Agnes, not Anne in this version of the story, and I just think her character is incredible. And what I love about this book is that Shakespeare is barely present. You know, he's such a huge character in literature, and yet Maggie O'Farrell has him on the sidelines. It's his absence from the household that matters, his absence that, you know, has an impact all the way through the novel. And I just thought that was wonderful. I am still walking through the fields with Agnes, observing the world through her eyes. It's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful book. And this is why I realised I'm out of time, because, as in achronological, because I read this book before I read Hamnet. And I'm really, really fond of My Sister, the Serial Killer by Oyinken Braithwaite, because this was the very first year that I was actually actively involved in the Women's Prize. It was the first year that I read the entire long list. And this was the book that I personally would have chosen to win that year, because I just thought it was so fresh and unusual. And I didn't have much experience of reading Nigerian literature either at the time. And Nigerian literature just seems to have exploded into our literary landscape, which I think is wonderful and really quite fascinating. So, you know, this took me on a whole different direction. And isn't that just the most stunning book cover ever? I mean, I just think it's wonderful. You've got the reflection of the knife in the glasses and everything. It just, from start to finish, I found this absolutely addictive. I know she's got a new novel out and I haven't read it yet, and I can't wait. And then finally, and those of you who've been watching my channel for any time will probably know what I've got in my hand here, because I think the most powerful book that I've read in the last year or two has been this one, Prophet Song by Paul Lynch. I absolutely adored this book, and it's really difficult to explain why, but for me, it was absolutely pitch perfect. I think probably because it tells the story of a kind of only very slightly futuristic Ireland, and there's a knock on the door, and it's clearly a sort of very dictatorial, tyrannical government who've taken over, you know, a military government, and the father of the house is taken into police custody, and it tells the story of how the mother and the rest of the family cope in his absence. But there is something this is a novel where I can't believe this hasn't actually happened. It's so real in my head, and the sense of sort of menace and dread tied in with the domestic routine of everyday life of a mother with children. And the other thing I loved about this was that the woman in the book, the mother, is a scientist. I really like that. We don't see that often enough in novels. But yeah, I loved the writing. I loved the evocation of the place and the darkness. I thought this was utterly superb. So on that note, well, I would love to say I wonder what the next 60 years hold, but I think I'm pushing my luck. But I'm certainly looking forward to at least another decade of reading, and hopefully wanging on about books on this, you know, through this medium as well, and talking to all you lovely lot. So if you are of a similar age to me, which I know some of you who watch my channel are, I wonder what books you would choose for your decades of reading. It really has been an interesting sort of challenge to myself, reflecting in this way and thinking about just how important books have been in lots of different ways through the course of my life. Anyway, happy reading to you all. Hope that was vaguely interesting, and yeah, take care. Let me know what what you would choose. Bye.